Well, the opposition and their Western supporters have weighed in on the Syrian election. The United States has denounced Syria's presidential election, calling it a disgrace.
Today's presidential election in Syria is a disgrace. Bashar al-Assad has no more credibility today than he did yesterday. Elections should be an opportunity for the people of a free society to be consulted and to play an important role in choosing their leaders. Instead, such a process was inconceivable today in Syria, where the regime continued to reject the courageous calls for freedom and dignity that started more than 3 years ago. Detached from reality and devoid of political participation, the Assad regime's staged election today continues a 40-year family legacy of violent suppression that brutally crushes political dissent and fails to fulfill Syrians' aspirations for peace and prosperity.
Well, the Western-backed Syrian opposition also dismissed the election, calling it a sham, and NATO said the election was a farce.
Today's presidential
Assad, in the turmoil and the crisis that he had pulled the country into, he's trying to put this play where he's claiming that there are other candidates, people who are going to run against him. But everybody knows, Bashar al-Assad knows, every Syrian knows, almost everybody in the world knows that this is all a sham, not real.
The Syrian presidential election is a farce. It doesn't fulfill international standards for free, fair and transparent elections. And I'm sure that no ally will recognize the outcome of these so-called elections.
With Reuters in the middle.
The West's opposition to the election is diametrically opposed to its previous stance, calling for an election to be held in Syria. The election is part of political reforms introduced by the Syrian government to resolve the 3-year conflict. Meanwhile, the Syrian army has been making gains on the battlefield against the fragmented opposition and their Western and Arab allies. Let's cross over to Los Angeles, joined by former U.S. congressional staffer, Mr. Rodney Martin. Thank you so much for being with us. In your perspective, the significance of this election, it appears that the turnout has been very good. However, we see the continual condemnation coming out of Western capitals. Your take, sir.
Well, it's a testament to the Syrian people's commitment to their country, that they went out despite this Western-inspired civil war and participated in their government process. I don't know who that was speaking. The first comment in which I think it was a Western spokesman, a U.S. government spokesman, which declared it to be a farce. But all of her comments were applicable to the United States political system, which basically suppresses United States citizens' participation in the democratic process. So, if anything, the United States political system is absolutely a farce.
Well, Mr. Martin, the election has taken place. It has been successful. As I said, the condemnation continues to come out of Western capitals. And now what? Do you think that the West will allow this process to take place in Syria, or will they continue with their support of the insurgency or terrorism, many would say, against the Syrian government?
Well, the election that the West wanted to take place was where the West would pick puppet candidates to stand for election, like they did in Afghanistan previously and in Iraq previously. So obviously they will continue to denounce this election, and they will continue to be state sponsors of terrorism and perpetrate terrorism against the Syrian people. Let's understand, this civil war is being perpetrated against the Syrian people. It's the civilians in Syria that is suffering as a result of this civil war that is being perpetrated by the West.
Well, and of course, this is not the same. This is not the only time that we've seen recent events also in Ukraine. That on the one hand, an elected candidate, basically there was a coup d'etat that was supported by the West, and then that was supported. My question, sir, for you, people on the ground, those who really support democracy and want to have be represented by their own elected officials, and yet the West seems to come together to fight these various forces throughout the world. What can be done? Because it appears that the Western media, mainstream media, also are supporting the political direction of these Western governments. So the people on the ground, whether they be in Syria or they be in Yemen or Egypt or Ukraine, what can be done?
Well, we are seeing some positive developments in Europe, for instance. The recent elections in Europe, we've seen some what we would call blowback against the EU and the Western interests that have perpetrated this horrific policies on the people in Ukraine, for instance. So we're seeing some positive developments. But what can people do? They're going to have to fight for their countries. They're going to have to continue to resist. Syria is a perfect example. President Assad and the people of Syria said no, and they fought for their country, and they are winning. Now, it's been horrific. The consequences have been horrific, but ultimately, I think that that is a good example where people just stood up and said no. They're going to stand against the Zionist-backed interests in the West.
Thank you so much for being with us out of L.A. Former U.S. congressional staffer, Mr. Rodney Martin.